Kia ora whānau. So this is going to be a 15-20 minute presentation, hopefully, on structuralism, post-structuralism, and this thing called binary oppositions. I'm just going to do a quick recap on social construction, because there's connections between structuralism and post-structuralism. And the main connection is really language. So, with social construction, we've talked about how language is key to how we construct our world, because it's through language that we make sense of our world. So there's connections through these two new traditions, intellectual movements that we're going to talk about in this presentation. So we're going to look at structuralism, binary oppositions, and post-structuralism. I'm not going to talk about deconstruction today, but we will get a chance to talk about that idea in class at some stage. But hopefully, with the videos that are on the repository plus this brief presentation, we'll be able to get an understanding of how and why these ideas might be quite useful for in the context of Indigenous studies. So post-structuralist theory has been taken up in kaupapa Māori theorising, so we'll get introduced to that a little bit later. So distinguished Professor Graham Smith's work, I know Russell Bishop has referred to, who is Professor Russell Bishop, who's at Waikato University, two esteemed Indigenous Māori academics, have in their own work used a lot of these ideas as well. So just to recap, so we know social construction argues that there is no reality out there for us to access. We create that reality through language. So essentially language is the center of all meaning. And it is through language that our thoughts and ideas are structured, our perception of the world is structured. So again, you think about a young child coming into the world, how do they make sense of the world? It's not until they actually develop language, words, and attach those words to people or objects in the world that they start constructing their perspective of the world. And so it's quite compelling, the idea that language is essential in relation to this notion of social construction. So what we're going to be looking at is structuralism, and what structuralism is really concerned with is what are the rules of language that govern the way we produce meaning through that language. So I could guess that's probably the most important thing to remember about structuralism. So just by the name, you can understand, okay, it must refer to structure, whatever that is. And so these ideas that have come in that have influenced this tradition of structuralism have come through an analysis of language and how language actually works. So if we can understand the nature of language and how meaning is produced through it, then we can get closer to understanding reality, or our reality in terms of human beings. So structuralism asserts that there are universal structures, okay, underlying structures and rules within their structures that ensure meaning is stable. So in terms of language, linguistic structuralism, so linguistics is the study of language. So in terms of language as a structure, language has rules within it that constitute and govern meaning. And so we're going to be looking at, I guess, the pioneer of this idea, who was a linguist. And so linguistics really is the scientific study of language, right? And it really looks at understanding how language works in terms of establishing meaning. And so there's a little diagram here that we're going to be looking at in coming up slide as well, but you can see how we have an image of something out there in the world, let's say, so and then words attached to all those objects in that world. So you've got there the tree, the house, the door, the dog, the cat, shirt, pants. So we think of the world out there as reality. Then how we make sense of that world out there is that we attach language to it. So we attach words to it. So the notion of house, you can see there it's got the house. So we know that that object in the world is called the house. Same with the door. And so if you think of a young child would come in and that's how they would start making sense of their world. They would be attaching word sounds that we give them, not written words because they're too young to read, but they would hear the word cat, for example, and we would point to the cat, and they would know that the sound cat relates to that object in the world. So social construction talks to that idea as well. And so here we are sort of attaching these words to objects in the world and creating this language, right? So structuralism will sort of suggest, well, the meaning of that cat, that object in the world, that cat, is not just as simple as us attaching a word or sound to it and then it will forever be the cat. There's actually another part to this structure of language that gives meaning, and that is that when this word is attached to an object in the world, its meaning also comes from what we might see as being naturally different or opposed to it. So cat, when we attach the word cat to that object in the world, we might also bring meaning to what cat is in relation to what it's not. And so it's not a dog, all right? Or it's not a shirt, or it's not pants, or it's not a tree. So language then will show it's these differences between the words that we attach to objects in the world that also contribute to their meaning. And so this is this idea of structuralism, that the structure also contributes to the meaning that we give to individual units inside language. So where did this sort of thinking and theorizing come from? And it was a Swiss linguist called Ferdinand de Saussure, who's basically known as the father of structuralism. And why is he important is because his ideas the ideas that stemmed from his original work has gone on and influenced a whole lot of different fields and disciplines, such as sociology and psychology, in terms of this idea of structure constituting meaning. But anyway, his key work or focus was on how does language work to produce meaning. So that's what his study was about. And he developed a scientific method to understanding language, or how language works. And so this scientific method was really what the key was, because if it's a scientific approach to understanding reality through language, then geez, can we apply that approach to other fields, to other areas? So not just language, but how culture and society works, or how people's thinking works. So psychology now was interested in this method of structuralism. So he had a huge influence on what we know today as important disciplines in the humanities, such as psychology and sociology. So he was interested in what are the rules that govern or constitute meaning in language, and he came up with some rules or some concepts that he thinks were important in that in the constitution of meaning. But it wasn't just that what constituted meaning, but how did it enable meaning to be stable? Because imagine if meaning wasn't stable, if we didn't have fixed meanings to words that we construct as a society, then how can we communicate to each other? So this was quite revolutionary sort of thinking back in his day. And so how do units of language, so units of language we refer to words, how does their meaning remain stable? And so he refers to language meaning and signs. So we're going to look at this notion of signs in terms of de Saussure's structural linguistics. So for him, units of language are called signs. Okay, so if we think of words or units in language as a sign, so think of cat. If we write the word cat as part of a sign, and the sign is split up into two parts. You have the cat, so the word and the sound. So we would see these squiggles on a page or on the computer that represent or that when we speak, those attach sounds to those letters. We have cat, right? So you have a word image and you have a word sound. But when we use that word or cat, or we say the word cat, then immediately there's a concept that comes into our head. There's a picture that comes into our head that associates to that that word sound. So the word sound, cat, is what he calls the signifier. The concept that we attach to it in our minds is what he calls the signified. Okay, so the word sound. So if you see the word cat on the wall and you say the word cat, immediately this image comes into your mind. The word sound is the signifier and the image in your mind is the signified, and that makes up the sign. So language is made up of all these signs. And so this is one of the rules of the structure of language, according to de Saussure, is that signifier and signified is stable. So cat as a word and the image that we have in our minds, that it gives meaning to that object in reality, is a stable rule of language. Okay, so we all come up with the same image. All right, so he says in language, the sign is important and the signifier and signified is part of the rules of how language works. And so there's another image there that talks to that. So you see there the tree, T-R-E-E, and then the image above it. Word or language is made up of units or words that have stable meaning because you have a signifier that's attached to the concept in our mind that we then attach to the object in the world. So that was one of the key rules of his analysis of language and how language worked. So that was an assumption for Saussure that the signifier and signified were stable, and that's how meaning was. One of the ways that meaning is stabilized in language. Also, they do accept that the connection between the sign and the object in the world, and we talked about social construction as arbitrary. So the sign cat and the object we assign it to in the world, we know there's no inherent connection between that sign and the object. So we could have called cat dog. All right. So the signifier would have changed, would have been dog. The concept or image wouldn't have been the cute fluffy cat, it would have been a dog instead. And sorry, take that back. The signifier would have changed, so it would have been dog, but the image still would have been the cat. All right, so the sign, the signifier, and the signified then now is becoming unstable if we understand that it's just an arbitrary connection between the sign and the object that's in the world. So that sort of idea that we can change the signifier, for the signified, start sort of saying, well, actually, your structure isn't as stable as you think. And that's where the post-structuralist thinkers started coming in and started criticizing his breakdown or understanding of language, because you say, well, hang on, I don't think it's as stable as you think it is, and meaning therefore is not as stable as you think it is within the structure that you're talking about. So basically that's just repeating what I mentioned earlier, but meaning through language is therefore based on the meanings produced by the individual units, so the signs within a larger structure. And this is another important rule that fits within structuralist theory, is the differences between those signs also gives them meaning. So not just the signifier being attached to a concept in the world, in our mind and then in the world, but it's also within the language there are these differences between the signs that contribute to their meaning. And the most obvious ones are what he refers to as binary opposites. So, for example, cat and dog is a binary opposite. So the meaning of cat gets reaffirmed because we have a meaning of dog. And so this opposite, these two opposites actually help affirm the meaning of each term. So hot and cold. So we can't understand what hot is without having understanding what cold is. Old and young, right and wrong. So there was another key part of de Saussure's analysis of language. He says binary opposites are key, essential to stabilizing meaning as a part of that greater structure. So to put it in another way, words and their meanings cannot be only understood in isolation. They can only be understood in the context of the larger structure they are a part of and the differences produced by the unit's words inside that language. So the binary opposites, these pairs of binary opposites are really important as well to the stability of meaning inside language. So these were sort of really amazing ideas that were coming through when de Saussure was doing his work. And those ideas were taken up by other fields and still being used today. So anthropology, which is really the study of cultures, and mankind, really, because anthropos means sort of humankind or mankind. So ology is the study of mankind and cultures, and so there's commonalities between anthropology, sociology, and psychology, and literature. So all these different fields that sort of study that were about understanding the human condition. How do we come to know ourselves in the world we live in? So his ideas were really, really influential, and they were particularly picked up by an anthropologist called Levi-Strauss, who's a most famous sort of cultural structuralist who applied de Saussure's ideas to his analysis of different cultures. So he said there are universal rules across cultures all across the world. So you might be different cultures here, but there are these sort of universal structures and rules that you can compare across those different cultures. And so again, he was using binary oppositions as a way to say that that's a universal sort of rule that's governed across across cultures through all around the world. So a definition for binary oppositions then: a binary oppositions are pairs of related terms or concepts that are opposite in meaning. So in language we have binary opposites. So in cultures as well we would have these binary opposites, but it's very much a Western construct, very much a Western term. In indigenous cultures, it's a bit harder to sort of identify where there might be these binary opposites, but the difference is binary opposites known from a Western sort of tradition has also this sort of hierarchy attached to it. So where one term in the binary is privileged over another. And that's where post-structuralism came in. They were, again, critical of the stability of meaning that de Saussure talks about through language, through these rules such as binary oppositions, because he says, well, one, they create a hierarchy. So what does that mean for cultures and societies? Two, the stability of meaning within those hierarchies is not as stable as you think it is. So if we think of a male-female binary opposition and we use a cultural sort of lens to understand that, we can use binary oppositions to explain the way that women have been marginalized historically over time, because in a Western concept, the binary between male and female sees men being privileged over women. So you can see how this concept becomes quite interesting to challenge some of the ways that certain groups in society have been mistreated and still being mistreated today. So in terms of structuralism, though, for de Saussure and language, binary opposites weren't meant to be this hierarchy. They were just this essential way that meaning was produced, and that it was a complementary sort of relationship. But post-structuralists disagreed and said it's not complementary, it's actually a relationship of power, where you have the dominant term in the center and then the marginalized term on the outside. And you can see how straight and gay can be used as an example for that. So in a structuralist analysis, and I've put their post just before that, would be an approach to analysing language, if you're de Saussure, or human culture, if you're Levi-Strauss, to analyse thinking, if you're working in psychology and behaviour. So it was a way to analyse these different aspects of human culture and society, which focuses on the fact that elements inside language or inside a culture can only be understood in relation to an overarching structure and the set of rules or conventions that govern meaning, particularly, for example, in binary opposites. So it was meant to be this sort of clean method to be able to understand different aspects of human society and human culture. But it was post-structuralists who really challenged that and said, well, your binary opposites are all mud. They're not as stable as you think they are. Your signifier and signified can slip, so meaning can slip from the signifier and the signified. And according to Jacques Derrida, who we would refer to as a post-structuralist, meaning in the West has always been defined in terms of these sort of binary opposites that have created this violent hierarchy where one of the two terms governs, oppresses the other. And an example is a black-white binary opposition, and we look historically at the way that black and white as an analysis of different cultures have been treated historically. The way that black is looked at being evil or reference to death in relation to white, which is pure and enlightening. So you can see how in Western sort of thought, binary logic has had quite a strong influence on the way that people of the West see the world. So an example of that is the colonized example as a binary opposition. So some of the key differences, I guess, between structuralism and post-structuralism. One commonality is that they both acknowledge binaries exist. But structuralists would suggest that meaning is stable within that structure and constituted through that underlying structure, whereas post-structuralists would say, no, meaning is not stable and it's not just dependent or solely dependent on the structure that exists, but also the interpreter. They would actually put more emphasis on the interpreter rather than the structure, or the individual rather than the structure. Structuralists would sort of assume there's a single truth or meaning. Post-structuralists would say, well, no, there's multiple truths, actually. And they'll give you examples of that. Structuralism sort of accepts that there is an objective reality and that through the structure of language, for example, we can tap into that and have an understanding of that reality. Post-structuralists would say, well, the only reality is the one we construct in our minds through language. So that's quite a key difference between structuralists and post-structuralists. Because it's a governing structure that determines meaning, structuralists are looking for universal sort of truths and ideas and rules that govern meaning. So the structure that constitutes meaning as a universal truth, the signifier and signified as stable elements, that's a universal truth. The binary that constitutes meaning between two terms is essential, that's a universal truth. Whereas post-structuralists tend to be not interested in universal truths, but more in the differences that are occurring inside language, those little slippages in meaning. We think everybody will see things this way. A post-structuralist would be fascinated by someone who sees it totally different. Ka pai? And structuralists would say meaning is constituted by these underlying structures, so it's anti-humanist. So it's the structure rather than the human being that constitutes meaning. Power of meaning, therefore, is handed over to the system rather than the individual. Post-structuralists might tend to agree with that. They recognise the power of these structures to determine meaning, but allow for individuals to construct new meanings, to interpret things in different ways. So again, structuralism says structure, so it's the key word, determines meaning, whereas post-structuralists would say, well, they might sort of agree with that, but their focus is on really the interpreter or the speaker or reader operating within the structure rather than the structure itself. Because if our reality is determined by the structure, then we aren't determining our own reality, which sounds a little bit depressing. But interesting ideas. But we will talk a bit later around how and why these ideas will be important for us in class. So I hope this has helped you with your forum posts. Please go in and look at the videos that I put in the repository and do your own research as well, because some other explanation might be able to help you, help with the penny drop. So just don't expect that it'll come straight away, but hopefully, by the end of this semester, we'll have a good understanding of what structuralism and post-structuralism are. Kia ora.